Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to our first ever look at the Book of Boba Fett. I'll be giving my full thoughts and breakdown of today's episode, which I quite enjoyed. But before we get into that, I want to take a second and wish everyone a happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed your time away from work or school, if you were lucky enough to get some. I've taken a strangely long break. It's probably the longest break since maybe my first kid was born, but what a way to return. And I was actually kind of surprised because I was thinking that this episode came out 24 hours after it did. All right, let's get started though. And first of all, I really like this episode. I think it did a lot right. There were some small nitpicks that I have and maybe some larger ones that others had, but overall there was a lot that the Book of Boba Fett has been doing right. First of all, the title. It's a reference to either the original biblical verse or perhaps the Robert A. Heinlein novel. When it comes to the title itself, I mean, Stranger in a Strange Land is probably a good description of what Boba Fett is at this point. We see a brief flashback of Kamino, which I absolutely love, a bit of alternate footage as well from the prequels, and now is on Tatooine, a planet which could not be more dissimilar to where he was raised. And that's actually one thing I really liked about this show, and one thing I think we'll be seeing throughout the series. It focuses pretty heavily on the personal journey of Boba Fett, and I think we'll be getting a good look at him as a character. And the offside of that is this first episode especially sort of lacked a traditional hook. We didn't see the Hondo Ohnaka or the Kira or whomever else that some people were expecting at the end of the episode to hook viewers in the future. However, I do think a prequel episode was needed, and I do think that the main point of interest in this series will be the evolution of the character and the creation of his criminal empire. Boba Fett is also not quite the character I expected him to be. He's weaker, and that's not a bad thing. I think that's an interesting vulnerability. We see that he can't always just tank a bunch of people and fight off against incredible odds. In fact, right now it seems like Fennec Shand is the far more capable of the two, especially where Boba Fett is going through his Bacta treatments. I also thought his backstory was pretty interesting. I mean, it's very cool to finally see the moment where he emerges from the Sarlacc pit. The inside of the creature was absolutely disgusting. I thought they did it perfectly. It reminded me of some art I've seen before. Some people say they wish they had focused on that a bit more, but I don't really know what they could have done to extend that without making it feel unnecessary. This is just another thing that's happened to Boba Fett. And on that note, I do think the flashbacks will be a recurring storytelling device throughout this series. Maybe it's every time he goes into a Bacta bath, anytime he sleeps, we'll get a look at the sort of time between episode 6 and the beginning of The Mandalorian season 1 or 2. I'll come back to the flashbacks in a minute. I want to talk about the present day and the way that story is shaping up. First of all, of course, we see Boba Fett basically running the shop. He's instantly got the fear and respect of a lot of Mos Espa's population. And I will note, by the way, I was wrong. I assumed that this would not be Mos Espa because it doesn't look like the location we see in episode 1. But when you see Mos Espa in the show, you can tell that not only are there these craters where much of the city is, probably because it's cooler down there, but also plateaus and flatlands. So the Mos Espa we see in episode 1 is probably the outside edge of the city where this is more of the populated center. But I find it interesting that the mayor is not just giving in to Boba Fett's demands. He's presumably the one who has sent the thugs in after him, and it could be that he's connected to some greater power, some other crime lord, somebody else who's moved in since Jabba's death, where Bib Fortuna was happy to sort of get fat on his throne. Still, we don't really know where that's going, and I think that's definitely the source of some of the complaints that I've seen so far. One thing, however, that I did like, even in this brief little bit of the episode, is how much life the Book of Boba Fett is giving to Tatooine. There were some definitely obvious callbacks meant to be fan pleasers. One example would be Max Rebo. Who doesn't love our strange little blue elephant friend with the arms that are actually legs? We had the torture droid from Jabba's. It looked like there was the droid from Star Tours manning one of the tables, but there were also some smaller details too. It seems like the Trandoshan presented Boba with a Wookiee pelt, which is appropriate not only for the Trandoshan, which of course hunt Wookiees, but also Boba, who did have a braided Wookiee hair on his armor. I also like how that Twi'lek asked if Boba wanted his Gamorreans hosed and fed, which was just really funny. And we saw what looked like a moisture theft from moisture farmers, presumably. All of that was great, and I also just felt like the Mos Espa streets were very lively. There were lots of interesting designs. Just overall, really well done from a production standpoint. point. I'll talk a bit more about the flashbacks now. I thought they were handled very well. There's definitely more story to be told there. We've seen scenes of what looks like Boba Fett breaking into Tashi Station. I'm guessing that will be a flashback as well. Tusken Raiders always offer a pretty interesting dynamic, especially when you have the children involved. They're just brutally beating Boba Fett 1 minute, but he eventually gains their respect by fighting Sand Machamp. On the note of that monster, I do have some thoughts about what it might be, whether it's a new design or something from Star Wars Legends. I'm going to leave that for a future video this week, but it was a very interesting design. Reminded me of sort of a 60s monster in a good way. It felt pretty on home for Tatooine. Those are my general thoughts. Again, it's harder to talk actual story because there just wasn't a whole lot here. This was a lot of setup, a lot of showing where Boba Fett got to where he is, some of his scars, both figurative and literal, and I assume that we'll get a better look at the upcoming story next week. So that's definitely a real complaint, although not one that I personally had. One issue I did have though was with the action. It felt a little heavy and a little bit slow, and again, that may have been on purpose to sort of emphasize Boba Fett's strength, but also his weakness, the fact that he's clearly injured and not up to 100%. I do hope though that the choreography is a little bit improved for future shows and future episodes. Oh, I gotta say, I did also think the intro music was very cool. The intro and the outro music worked perfectly. It's very different. It gives off a different vibe than The Mandalorian, which this show definitely needs to do. Otherwise, it will just feel like The Mandalorian Season 2.5 rather than its own thing. But guys, that's all I have for now. Until next time, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.